Welcome to Maine Voices Livestream. Before we begin, some messages from our sponsors.
Along the river's edge, there's a special place where concrete gives way to water and trails. A place for nurturing and healing, where advanced medicine and compassionate people come together. Introducing the new Northern Light Mercy Hospital, offering more services in one convenient location and the same care we started with, that's accessible to all. Because Maine made us devoted to the health of our entire community.
The Portland area's trusted choice for senior living, Stroudwater Lodge, gives Maine seniors independence and families peace of mind. Residents enjoy chef-prepared meals, unique programming like beer brewing or classes led by local artists, along with all the maintenance-free benefits of community living. With their sister community, Avita, specializing in memory care on the same campus, Maine families have a wide variety of care options in a beautiful wooded setting, yet minutes from downtown Portland. To learn more, visit stroudwaterlodge.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nita Lelyveld. I'm the managing editor of the Portland Press Herald, and I'm speaking to you tonight from our newsroom. I'd first like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Stroudwater Lodge, Hub Furniture, and our presenting sponsor, Northern Light Health. I'd also like to thank our loyal subscribers for reading us daily. You mean the world to us. We couldn't tell the stories we tell without you. I'm so excited about the conversation we're going to hear this evening between our guest, Susana Hancock, a multidisciplinary climate researcher, and our longtime feature writer, Ray Routhier, whose interests and stories also are diverse. Susana of Freeport travels the world, speaking passionately about the effects of climate change on our planet. She's stunningly accomplished for anyone at any age, even more so since she's in her mid-30s. She's earned 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from Oxford University. She speaks Russian, Czech, and Norwegian fluently and is conversant in Icelandic, Slovak, Swedish, French, Danish, and Hebrew. She's also a rower who, had it not been for an injury, might have made it to the Summer Olympics a few years back. And she's found time to be involved in local politics, to serve on a school board, to teach rowing at her alma mater, Waynfleet, in Portland. I know all this from a wonderful article Ray wrote about her in March. Ray writes about many things. In recent months, to name a few, he's told us about the evolution of the old port, a pandemic passion for cribbage, a DJ who loves K-pop, an artist who carves petroglyphs into rocks on trails. He writes about culture, entertainment, music, life, and, when the stars align, Arctic explorers. At the time he wrote about Susana, she was preparing to embark on a 240-mile Arctic expedition, tracing the route of a 19th century explorer in his unsuccessful attempt to reach the North Pole. To build enough strength to drag sleds on the trek, she was dragging tire wheels around Portland. To be ready for the very real threat of polar bears on the trip, she was learning how to shoot a rifle. I'm assuming Susana made it safely past the polar bears because she's here with us tonight. But I've been waiting for months to hear more about the trip and what that experience was like. I'm sure you have too. And so without further ado, please welcome Susana and Ray to our virtual stage.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, Susana. How are you?
Good evening. Hello, Ray. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us, and thank everybody out there watching who's interested in this. And as Nita said, I had talked to you back in March before this expedition, and it was going to be a 240-mile expedition, something like 650 miles from the North Pole, and you would be pulling your own gear on a sled, on skis in the Arctic with weather and polar bears, and carrying a gun in case of polar bears. So I guess my first question that I didn't ask you before is, why did you want to go on this expedition, especially knowing all the challenges, all the conditions, all the dangers? What were the things that motivated you to want to go?
That's a really good question. And I think I probably skipped over some of that in my brain. I was invited to apply for the expedition. I had to write a series of essays on what kind of research I'd be contributing, why I needed to do research in that area, about physical fitness, and why I was prepared, how I would be preparing mentally for this as well as physically. And I believe there was some other essay that I needed to write about why I needed to be involved, or maybe what I would be doing with the research afterward. And I think I focused on those parts and kind of skipped over the polar bears, the isolation, the cold. I don't know. I think it was just this fascination with the northern regions that I've had since I was a little kid. So, whether that was going out to Admiral Perry's summer house or talking with other people who've done, in Casco Bay for picnics, or talking with other people who've been out crossing the poles, I just always been something that was interesting to me. So when I had the opportunity, I jumped on it and kind of thought about those other effects later.
Was part of it the opportunity to see things for yourself that you had been reading about and studying about, and go see and touch and feel that stuff for yourself, as opposed to, I don't know, taking other people's word for it or studying, other people's data?
I think that's certainly part of it. I don't think that I necessarily had to see something for myself to know that it is true. I take other data, trust it type thing. But there's a tangible aspect that has definitely always been important to me. I lived in northern Norway for a little while, and so I just loved living in northern areas. I love the cold. I'd always wanted to travel to Svalbard. And the Arctic, I didn't necessarily expect it would be on skis, but that part of the world has always definitely drawn me for my own interests.
And when you talk about the cold, I wonder, I guess as somebody might ask you, was it cold enough for you? I mean, how cold was it in terms of, some of the temperatures and some of the wind, and what were some of the things that you had to do to brave the cold just for your daily routines of, pulling the sled, eating, sleeping, personal hygiene, that kind of stuff? How cold was it, and how did that, affect what your sort of day to day?
So the quick answer is that the lowest temperature that we recorded while there was about 40 below, and that's centigrade Fahrenheit crossover. But you add in winds that we had reaching about a Category 1 hurricane. So when you add in those kind of winds on top of that cold, it's definitely pretty nasty. I had gloves. I've got gloves here that are wool lined, pretty big. I would wear these with other gloves underneath. I had heaters on my hands, and that picture of me that you were using for the promotion with the frost on my hair and eyelashes, that day was probably one of the worst of the entire expedition, my total low point, except that picture was taken right at the moment when I realized we were stopping for the night. So that was beautiful. But I was skiing. I couldn't get warm. My hands were so cold. I was getting frostbite on my face. So I was wearing a wool balaclava, had to get that taken off, had to have somebody else put on this neoprene one on my face. I had other people having to take gloves off of me. I ended up having to put my hands in the armpits of the 5 men that I was traveling with. They took turns rotating around with my hands in their armpits while they were eating on our breaks. And so there were definitely things like that were made it definitely cold. But it was all part of the adventure. And I guess I just love being, I wouldn't say I love being cold, but I love the cold. And yeah,
I think you had
guess
mentioned before that but that the cold actually kept you from sleeping some nights, right? That it
it
was so cold.
did. The first couple nights I really struggled to sleep, and I had a sleeping bag that was rated to 70 below zero, and I had a liner in the sleeping bag. Because one thing that I hadn't realized the degree to which this was going to be an impact, but we sweat a lot at night, and I knew that cognitively, but not necessarily the degree to which we'd sweat. So we'd wake up in the morning. I'd sleep in this down sleeping bag, but down can't get wet. So I'd sleep in this liner, sort of a vapor liner, and it would collect sweat basically. And so first tasks in the morning were to get out of the sleeping bag and dry off. And the only way to dry off really is to use body heat. So I would be sitting there in the tent, which would be maybe 0 degrees inside, maybe a little bit below zero. And we'd try to keep enough ventilation so that the tent wouldn't get warm with our bodies and cooking, because that would create condensation, creates more moisture that we can't dry. And I would just be radiating steam. And I would sit there for the first hour, 45 minutes, hour of the day, just evaporating. And that was really cold because, sitting there in a layer of wool, just sort of some long underwear, trying to dry off before I could put any other clothing on.
Wow.
But it also meant that, then we'd have to dry out or clean the vapor liners that we were sleeping in, because they would be accumulating moisture. So we'd take those out, and luckily the moisture would freeze instantaneously. So you just take them outside and shake them, and you have this little personal snowstorm. But
Wow.
I think, the cold, it really brought down so much of our being there. It was just daily survival. I mean, yes, we were doing research, but it was taking us 7 hours a day to get enough water for our food, and for never mind personal hygiene, but food and drink was about 7 hours of boiling water.
You had to boil the water?
We had to boil the water. So
for that long, yeah.
Collect snow. We just had really small stoves, and we had really poor quality fuel. That was the only thing we could get locally. So stoves kept clogging up, and if we got through a day with the stove working, that was considered a success. But it just brought down to how much of our daily existence was survival. And
so of all those daily routines, what was the biggest challenge of those, I guess?
Ooh.
The toughest thing. I mean, none of them sound easy.
No, I think to some degree the monotony. It's just knowing that I have to wake up in the morning and leave time for 3.5 hours of water boiling, and sitting there being cold for most of that time.
Yeah.
I really would rather stay in the sleeping bag after I finally figured out how to be warm in it and get some sleep. And, going out on the ice and skiing, and sometimes we wouldn't see anything for several days at a time. And it would just be whiteout blizzards, or, I'd maybe see the person in front of me in our little line, but that would be about it. And so, not just having that monotony for days on days at times, I start seeing faces in the snow and things like that. So
what did you guys eat?
So we had a mixture of different things. I brought some things from home. I made some cereals, sort of a porridge type thing with lots of nuts and fruits. And I made some snack bars that I would have with me. Had some lots of nuts and seeds. But we also ate some freeze-dried food that was donated by the Swedish military. And that was okay. It was calories. And I think after the first week, we began to appreciate the calories. I wouldn't say it was any better than that, but it was calories. And I think one of the biggest disappointments I had was I got off the ice, and we went at our first day back in civilization, so to speak. We went to a restaurant, and I got a big lentil stew, and discovered that my stomach had zero tolerance for real food. So that took about a week to acclimate back to normal food.
Did you lose weight from this month-long trip?
No, not really. I mean, I did put on a bit of weight before I went intentionally, and I might have lost a little bit from that, but I've been pretty good about making sure that what I'm eating is matching the exercise that I'm doing or the activity that I'm doing. And, you know, that was important to me, not just, you know, sort of losing fat stores, but just to keep energy levels up and to keep warm. You know, I have friends that, and we did this a little bit, friends that, you know, go on these expeditions and they'll bring bottles of oil just because you can drink oil and warm up a lot faster than drinking warm water or something. We would put blocks of coconut oil or nut butters in our foods just to get those extra calories.
Wow. And so overall, how was your health during this? I mean, did you injure yourself in any way or come down with anything out there in the Arctic?
Yeah, my first couple of days, I got a bit sick, started getting bronchitis, which was a little bit concerning because it's not the area where everyone wants to be, and catching bronchitis. And that cleared up after about a week. I had a pretty good sinus infection and cough for a little while. I was a little bit concerned that maybe I caught something.
So were you able to rest, or did you just still have to pull your sled every day and ski every day?
For me, I never got to the point where I needed rest. We did have somebody else on the team who did get sick, and not certain what he came down with, whether it was just a fatigue induced something. But we did have to take a couple days where it was a little bit lighter. And that's not just for his recovery. I mean, it was, but it also, you know, it affects everybody when somebody's not well. You know, we're all, there's 6 of us to our team, you know, it's in everybody's interest that everybody's doing as well as possible. And we did have to cut one day short when somebody had eaten something to which he was allergic and got quite ill to that. Wow. Not seriously ill, but too sick to continue. And this also meant with this first person who did get sick, you know, several of us had to, you know, we really had to empty out his sled and carry his belongings, just because cumulatively we needed to make progress, and he was losing strength and wasn't able to pull his own material to the same degree.
So how much weight were you pulling most days?
So I was pulling about 150 pounds, which was a little bit more than I started. On our second or third day, I made a rookie mistake, and that's we were going up a hill, and I was doing great. I was fine. I'd been described as a hamster, which was basically the fact that we had this technical guide, and he said right behind him, I was always there, never got very far behind. I was just sort of go. And I think that was me trying to feel that I was definitely the smallest. I was the only female. I had one person on the team who was a little bit, he was making comments that, you know, I might not be able to keep up. So I had to sort of prove myself a little bit, but we were going up this hill and I felt okay. Somebody said we had 2 kilometers left, and we had one person who was really struggling at that time. So the rookie mistake here is he said he needed somebody to carry some of his material. He wasn't going to make it up the hill. So I said, sure, load me up. And I figured, you know, what's 2 kilometers? I can do that. So he loaded up my sled. We got there, we got to the top, and I went to return everything to him, and he said he didn't want it back. He had given it to me, so it was mine for the trip.
Wow.
So I was probably at about 150 pounds from a fairly early pass, which is a chunk heavier than I am too.
Yeah. How many miles a day or kilometers a day did you have to go?
If we made it's totally dependent on the conditions. You know, if it was a blizzard going uphill, it was a lot slower than if we were going downhill, if we were on the sea ice. But generally speaking, a good day was about 15 or so kilometers, maybe a little bit more. But at times we were going only a kilometer, maybe 2 kilometers an hour. So wow. 15 kilometers could take 10, 12 hours of skiing. And you have to, you know, factor that in with the 7 hours that we were at camp boiling water and trying to get enough sleep that, you know, weren't necessarily getting 8 hours of sleep, but enough that we could function and go on with the next day. We did take a few rest days, both mostly they ended up being due to storms and weather that we just couldn't ski. But occasionally it was just general fatigue. And I definitely spent one of those. I think I slept the entire way through it. Didn't realize that we had that day off at all.
And were you guys always in tents, or some of the pictures show you sort of digging shelter into the snow?
Yes. So the idea was tents, and we had these, as you've seen in the photos, they look very much like your normal camping tent. And they are made to withstand winds up to a Category 1 hurricane. So they're cylindrical, and as long as they're aimed into the wind, basically, they can withstand a Category 1 hurricane. We would build walls of snow around them. So just if you think of sort of a stereotypical igloo type blocks of snow, we'd build these walls, and it would basically channel the wind around the tent. And this also, kept the wind, but it also kept the snow from landing on the tents as well when in the wind. And we'd always, sleep with our feet into the wind, so that when the snow did accumulate, which it inevitably would, it sort of lands on our feet rather than our heads. But those tents were good up to, it's at a Category 1 hurricane. Anything stronger than that, we had to dig ourselves into the snow. And the different ways of doing that, whether it's just digging into a snowbank or actually making a pile of snow and then digging out places. And we did have one night when we did have a tent pole snap because the winds were a little bit too high. So probably should have spent at least one more night in a snow cave, but that became a full team rescue mission to save that tent.
What did you have to do to save the tent?
So the biggest concern we had at the time was that we had about 20,000 euros of audiovisual equipment in that tent when it collapsed. So we had somebody in it too, but so he was of interest as well. But we also went with two 4-person tents and a 3-person tent, with the idea that gave us space for the equipment, because we were producing a documentary on this and a photography series. So that gave us space for that extra equipment, but it also meant that if we did lose a tent due to just destroying it, that we could fit everybody in the remaining tents. So we had an all hands on deck little emergency where, because of course the winds are still going, they don't die down at click of the finger. And so my job was to go out and clear out as much of the snow from the tent as I could. I was building a new snow wall, really reinforcing, making it a lot taller. We had 2 people who were trying to get out the broken sections of the tent. It was just one section. It turned out it was just one section that had completely snapped, but it did tear a little bit of the tent. So it took 5 of us to be able to get out the broken section, create a repair, and then insert that back. So that turned out, the big issue with that was that the wind had slightly switched directions overnight. So while we were still in quite the strong winds, it wasn't hitting the tent quite in its strongest area. So it just rotated slightly, and probably should have repitched the tent, and that didn't happen.
And I was curious, or when we first talked, I was, I guess, surprised at first, but just sort of amazed that to go on this expedition, you had to learn to carry a rifle, to fire a rifle. So I wondered, and I know you did physical preparation, you pulled tires around Portland to get used to the sort of the movement of the sled, but what did you do to learn how, did you have to go to a firing range to learn how to fire a rifle, or did you have to take a course? What did you have to do for that?
So I didn't have to do too much in terms of the background preparation, but I went to the firing range. I went with LL Bean. They provided me with a shotgun and a rifle that were the same caliber and a very similar model to the ones that were donated for me to use on this expedition, so that I could get used to figuring out how the weight of it was, what the rebound felt like, and learn about the aim. And that was excellent. And except I did give myself a black eye in the process with not quite having it balanced at one point, but it's all a learning game. And certainly on my first day out on the ice, one of our tasks was demonstrating capacity with the rifle, and we made little snow targets, which for me was a very nerving experience. It was a really cold day. I was struggling to be warm in the rifles. We couldn't wear heavy gloves. We were wearing much lighter things. My hands were really cold. And suddenly, we're talking not just about shooting targets and aiming and how to load the rifle, how to take multiple shots back to back to back. Because certainly if you're, we don't want to have to kill a polar bear, but if you're going to aim for a polar bear, you're aiming to kill it. So, and if you miss, how do you fire with that? And it was for me a very visceral experience. I'd never shot anything other than a target. And suddenly, having this block of snow, which was just a block of snow, what we were talking about, the anatomy of a polar bear is very different than the anatomy of other bears. So where do you shoot at a polar bear? How do you do it? And then suddenly trying to demonstrate this, I was nauseous. I felt dizzy. I did mine and then immediately went and had to go sit down because I was just feeling really unwell. And yeah, but after that probably feeling lasted with me for a day or two of just feeling really uncomfortable with the whole thing. But after that, it just became an act of normal existence. And the rifles, I think sleeping next to a rifle was definitely something that's uncomfortable for me. But again, just after a day, it was just have the rifle, and certainly anytime leaving the campsite, leaving with was grab a rifle, toilet, whatever.
And
it was.
Did you or any of your team members encounter a polar bear?
No, we didn't, but we were in an area where we were just coming up to an area where we would have countered polar bears without any question. One of the most densest regions in the world of polar bears. And we were about to ski into that. And we got a warning that there was a big blizzard coming. It lasted about 5 days, or would last about 5 days. And we decided that was probably not the place we wanted to be for this blizzard. It was going to be a storm where we probably weren't going to leave tents. We weren't going to really be able to see much. Polar bears, frankly, don't care if it's a blizzard. They just keep on polar bearing. We, on skis, we're not getting away from anybody with any speed. And so we had options. We were right on the northern cusp of the Svalbard archipelago, so just a couple 100 miles south of the North Pole. And we had options of heading out into the sea ice or heading up into a glacier to avoid the polar bears. And just because of where the polar bears, they're pretty predictable with their food sources, that yes, we had a risk of seeing one in either out to sea or up on the glacier, but it would be much lower. And so we did that, and we didn't see polar bears, but we figured that we'd rather be safe, especially in conditions where bear fences wouldn't work. We had one, but in that kind of weather, and even in the cold, they're pretty well known for short circuiting, and we can't keep watch effectively in bad weather.
And I wondered, I know your expedition was sort of retracing the steps of an 1872, 1873 expedition. And I just wondered, because I'm sure things have changed a lot in that area since then, did you guys have to change your route because of conditions? Like, did you find areas where there had been, in 1872, an ice route, and now it was open water, that kind of thing? Did you find much of that?
Absolutely. And forget 1872. I mean, forget 150 years ago. We changed our route 5 times from when we started, just based on conditions that we were encountering. The climate significantly has changed since 1872, but this part of the world is warming about 7 times faster than the rest of the planet right now. And so if you think of that in terms of numbers, generally we're talking that the globe on average has warmed 1.2 degrees centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. And that's the average warming per decade of this part of the world. So that alone caused numerous changes for us. We thought we'd be able to cross a section of sea ice, only to get there to discover it was completely liquid. And yeah, so we had lots of amendments that we needed to take, and ultimately we weren't able to trace the 1872 expedition too closely. We did the best that we could, but there's sections that were physically not possible.
And did you say that Svalbard or just the Arctic in general is warming 7 times faster?
So the Arctic right
parts?
now is averaging about 4 times faster than the rest of the world, and that was a study that just came out in August. But that's about where it's encroaching. But Svalbard is one of the regions that's warming exponentially faster than that.
And the snow has something to do with that, right? The reflection. Can you explain that a little bit? Because
absolutely. So one of the things that I've always found interesting, and actually was one of the reasons I got into polar science to begin with, was about this what we call albedo effect, which has to do with the reflectivity, or how much solar radiation is absorbed by the Earth versus reflected off. So when a surface is white, so ice, snow, etc., it reflects a lot more of the solar radiation and thus heat, whereas a darker surface absorbs a lot more. And so regions that are traditionally white, so the polar regions, typically reflect a lot more heat. But we also have processes of Arctic amplification and various Arctic feedback loops with thawing permafrost, and has different feedback cycles that mean that the Arctic is warming much faster. So when we get some warming and the ice starts to melt, it changes its color, as you've probably seen, that sort of spring slush that becomes a little bit bluer, it becomes a little bit darker. And eventually in the open ocean, when the ice is melting in the ocean, we just reached, I think the National Snow and Ice Data Center is going to call it today, whether we've reached the sea ice minimum for the year. But as that sea ice melts and more ocean is exposed, again, that's a darker surface and absorbs more heat. So that's some of the big reasons that the Arctic is definitely a planetary hotspot and warming so much faster. So exactly, it has to do with that snow, and it has to do with the conditions of the snow as well. If it's powder or hard pack, to put it bluntly, it reacts differently.
And I know in this expedition, you guys were obviously trying to promote awareness of global warming, and also observe the conditions there and document it, right, for this film that's going to be made out of the expedition. But I wondered specifically what sort of things you saw, or things that you were trying to study on the trip that either that surprised you, I guess, the most, or that stood out to you, things that you didn't expect, either in terms of the amount of something, or the or how drastically something had changed compared to what you thought it might be in terms of various conditions there.
So one of the things, going back to that 1872 expedition, and I should say that because that expedition was trying to be the first to reach the North Pole, it was a good 35 years, 40 years before anybody reached North Pole after that expedition. But they were trying to prove, so they took photographs, they documented everything. I mean, I can tell you what they ate on a daily basis. I can tell you the names of the reindeer that they brought with them.
Wow.
So we have all this data that is really great for climate science. It's not these journals and photographs. So, but just, they started from this place at just about 80 degrees north on the north of Svalbard. And we were there just about to the day 150 years later. And this team had 2 big ships. They got into this little harbor area, and they got iced in, and they were forced to stay for most of a year, iced in. And they were under orders to leave if they could get out. If you can break through the ice, go. And they couldn't. I stood on that same spot on the land side, and I reached down and I took water samples of liquid water from the shore. So,
Wow.
Just saying that this is, yes, it's 150 years, but the environment landscape has completely changed. And moreover, in those water samples, it's not clean water. I mean, I want to say that this is an area where we should have clean air, clean water. It's completely uninhabited. The closest civilization is a small town 300 miles away. Next is the town 1,000 miles away. And yet, there's plastic in the water. I mean, we've got bits of nylon fishing line, different.
You found those
Yes, in the
in
water.
Svalbard? Wow.
Microplastics, particles
Wow.
from, whether it's face washes or fleece jackets, things that get in the water, and they're not deposited there. They're deposited elsewhere in the world, get into the water systems. And due to the ocean currents and the global systems, they end up in the Arctic, because that's sort of at the terminus of the Gulf Stream and several other currents. So it's kind of an area where things accumulate. We have shipping that's increasing in this region, and the ships are producing black soot, black carbon with their exhaust, and that's getting into the snow, that's getting into the ice, that's getting into the atmosphere, the air there. So, the air isn't as pristine as we want to think it is. But then you have something like that soot that's black, it lands on the snow, it lands on the ice, it changes the reflectivity of the ice, it causes, again, some more absorption. And so, that was one for me, I think, on a cooler, more positive note. That was a fun discovery. Something I had completely been unprepared for was driftwood. And this is an area where there are no trees. We're hundreds, thousands of miles above the tree line. And yet along the ice, we would find trees, and they would be pulled up on shore. Some of them would still have root structures. And we could, and other people have been doing this as well, type and date the trees. And so in this one area, same place where I found this plastic, we had trees that were from the Industrial Revolution, from the Yukon Basin. And you could type and date the other trees in different areas and kind of recreate some of these historical climate patterns. So prevailing currents and various things. And I think that was something that was really neat. I was prepared for certain things to be washing up on shore, coming around there, but I hadn't really thought of entire trees en masse transversing the world.
What does that show? I guess that those trees could. Is it just the preserving power of ice? Is that what that tells us?
Certainly, yes. I mean, certainly with the cold does help with the preservation, and the fact that I don't know how long ago they were actually in the liquid water and how much they've been frozen on the ice, but seeing the prevailing currents and seeing something that didn't look like, I mean, it wasn't rotting wood, it was wood that you would think used to build your house, and indeed people are collecting this driftwood for construction, so it's very viable.
Well, I think it's about time to get to some questions that have been submitted in the Q&A area. So here's the first one. Says, were you satisfied with the outcome of the expedition, and any findings that you'd like to share? I know you just shared a bunch there, but were you satisfied with the outcome of the expeditions, and any other things that you wanted to share about it?
That's a tricky question. I think yes, in that we accomplished what we set out to accomplish, but the expedition, in terms of its impact, is far from over. I mean, we did the cold part, and we have a book coming out. We have a photography exhibition that's coming out in January. We have a documentary coming out. So things like that are still about the expedition and the weight that it can have are still forthcoming. So I'm still pretty actively engaged. So this continuing to shape what that expedition is and what it means. Other findings, I mean, it just, one of our big goals was to bring a human side to climate science. And I think that's one of the powers of the documentary. Is it's not just, I mean, Ray, you mentioned or asked earlier about, why go? Why is it about not wanting just to read other people's accounts? But for me, it's if I can, as part of this documentary, we're showing sort of the human side of going. It's a story not just of the climate, it's a story about people, and it's a story about us as well, and how we're experiencing what we're seeing. So I think there's a lot more to come, and that's kind of exciting for me to continue to think about.
And the next question is, the Arctic and Gulf of Maine are warming fast. Did you see discernible signs, and how did this inform your awareness of climate change on both places?
Yeah, indeed, the Gulf of Maine. I think that's one of the interesting things for me about Maine, being in Maine, is that it is warm. You know, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. It's changing, and it's very much linked into the Arctic. It's changing the trajectory of the Gulf Stream, and a lot of this has to do with the melting of Greenland and the Labrador Current going on. And we're seeing, certainly in the Gulf of Maine, we're seeing new fish species. We're seeing black sea bass that you can get at Harbor Fish in Portland, and that's a fish that we don't regulate in Maine. We regulate down south in the mid-Atlantic states. We're seeing seahorses being caught. We're seeing, our shrimp industry closed, lobsters going north, all of those changes. Our zooplankton no longer have this lipid layer, or many of them. We're seeing increasingly more without this lipid layer that they would have otherwise had from the more northern species. And, those same changes are being seen in Svalbard, seen in the Arctic, not necessarily those specific changes, but we're seeing sea star, we're seeing certain crabs that are now getting to Svalbard where they hadn't before, and this is causing geopolitical tensions between Russia and Norway specifically about who has access to those fishing territories, who has the rights to the continental shelf. And so these changes are certainly having widespread impacts. And seeing things like, glaciers that were just collapsing, seeing glaciers that are extinct, no longer there. And you're seeing this terminal moraines, which is sort of the sediment that the glaciers push around on the mountains. And there's no glacier. And this is what you want to see in the Alps, or not want to see. This is what you expect to see in the Alps, not at 80 something degrees north.
Right.
And seeing some of these where satellites had just started or hadn't even started picking up some of this yet. So these changes are just, right in our face and very, very much there.
And another question is, did you read The Worst Journey in the World by Gerard before your trip, or are you familiar with that book? Okay.
I didn't, but I'm writing it down now. Thank you very much. Excited to read that. And
this question is, due to plate tectonics and continual movements of the Earth's crust, could it be that the ice melt is due to subsurface geothermal activity more so than global warming?
Not in this area. So there is that tends to be a much smaller, where that's happened is a much more isolated local effect, and certainly not here.
And this reader asks to pinpoint more geographically where Svalbard is.
Yes.
They say they're having a hard time to find on the map. And I remember I had a hard time finding on the map too.
I know, probably needed to provide a map here. But if you envision the North Pole in Norway, and you go roughly approximately halfway between the far northern tip of Norway and the North Pole, you'll get to Svalbard. It's an archipelago. It's part of a treaty, or governed by a treaty from 1920 that gives international access to signees of that treaty, the US being one of them, along with about 40 other nations, but it's under sovereign status as part of Norway.
And when you say archipelago, so it's islands basically, and it's so sometimes on world maps it's hard to see because it's not that big, right?
No,
on a world map.
But it's at about the level of northern Greenland, about 80 degrees north.
And this question is, there are other natural factors that could cause global warming, such as the 11-year solar cycle and the effects of solar radiation in charging the ionosphere. That's a question mark at the end of that. Example, we are currently coming off the 11-year low portion of the cycle, solar cycle 25, and solar activity, sunspots, and therefore the ionosphere may not protect us from the effects of solar radiation, which could cause heating/cooling Question mark?
Yeah, I'm not quite
Yeah.
certain what that question is getting to.
Yeah, and it just went away, so I can't repeat it.
I mean, there's certainly changes in the atmosphere are relevant, but what we're looking at are really these long-term changes over millennia. And yes, there's always been, this variation in how the atmosphere reacts to warming and cooling, but it's longer term changes and trends that we're seeing, and some of these immediate short-term trends, but in compared to millennia of data.
And a couple other questions that we had gotten earlier. One reader asked, what can we do in Maine to help mitigate climate change? I guess, what kind of specific things in your everyday life here in Maine can you do that can help?
So I think, Maine is an interesting place because I think it's also, despite what saying about the Gulf of Maine, it's an area where one can feel relatively insulated from a lot of the effects in the rest of the world. We don't have the big fires. We don't have the big multi-day, multi-week, multi-month heat domes that are, boiling our bivalves effectively. We don't have the big storms that we're seeing elsewhere in the world. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to be doing. And I think one of the things that I've enjoyed over the past year and a half or so is working locally. And so I'm based in Freeport at the moment, and I had coffee a year and a half ago with one of my neighbors, and we were both talking about what things we might want to be doing, and we decided we wanted to run with this. And then it was like, oh, do we think we can get anybody else in town that might want to join us? And what areas of climate action would we target? Do we want to look at building codes? Do we want to look at solarization? Do we want to look at equity issues and climate finance? What do we want to be doing? And we spoke to a couple other people, and suddenly we had 12 different action groups and a nonprofit that has been off and running. So, I think it was just, for us, what was interesting with that is that there were so many people in town who were interested, concerned, wanting to know what to do, and didn't really know where to begin. And so providing that framework really gave people something to tap into. But yeah, so I mean, looking with other people, I'm certainly, a big fan of contacting senators who have a lot of control. I think that's one of the things where I feel as an individual citizen, it's hard to feel that one can have so much leverage. But Maine's the only state with both senators Angus King and Susan Collins on this Climate Solutions Caucus, so we have a little bit of sway there. Developing, working on transportation. I mean, 54% of our emissions are transportation related. So how can we mitigate those? But looking, and I think one thing that's exciting for me about climate action is that it doesn't need to be some big grandiose idea. I mean, taking, if you're looking at community action, rewilding, looking at consumerism, housing equity. I mean, that's all part of the picture. So whatever is passionate for you, whatever makes you interested, there's something you can do. And many towns have climate boards. So I'm on the town climate board as well, where we get to really shape a lot of what town council and city councils are doing, and working with people around the state to develop, to get grants, to get money to do bigger projects and liaise with other towns. And I think that's what's fun for me, but I think that's an area where everybody can have an impact, and especially if you don't know where to go, and tie into a framework.
And this is a similar question in terms of participation, but not so much about, I guess, climate change here. But this person says, how does a private citizen participate in polar research?
Good question. If I knew that answer, I would be doing more of it, to be fair. But no, so there are several different ways depending on exactly what your interests and backgrounds are. So there's certainly options in volunteer positions in the Arctic and Antarctica as research aides, field techs, and those are often advertised online through different universities at times, different places, but also depending on your background, your you may have specific skills that are needed at some of these research sites or on sailing vessels. So for example, Antarctica, the bases there are always looking for people with backgrounds in electricians, plumbers, IT specialists, chefs. Those are all areas that just help on the logistics side, keeping everything running. And it's a great way to be paid to do some of this as well, not just to volunteer, but to go down and work in a kitchen. And that's something that, one doesn't necessarily need a background in cooking, but an interest and ability to cook repeatedly for for groups of people. And, doing that, and then in that spare time while they're also engaging in some of the research. So those are a couple ideas.
And I imagine that, that's crucial. Those are crucial positions, right? Because if you're going to have in those places like Antarctica, people would have to be doing research, staying there for a long period of time, right? So they need cooks and electricians and IT people and everybody to keep all the different infrastructure running while they're there, right? They're not just there on their own.
No. And
yeah.
that infrastructure, especially during the field research seasons, which can be multiple months at a time. So going in and there's no way to necessarily, I guess certain times of the year, yes, but other times of the year, you can't bring in something else. So you're working with what you've got and it's troubleshooting and making things go through. So definitely people with different skills are needed and brought specifically for those skills.
And this reader asks about Antarctica specifically. They say they're going to Antarctica in December on the Antarctic Peninsula. And is there anything they should look for in particular as a bellwether of what's happening in polar regions?
Wow, I'm jealous. I'll say that first. I want to sign up. Antarctica is, just like the Arctic, melting quite rapidly. And it's a different phenomenon because the Antarctica has land underneath it. But what we're seeing now, and if you've heard of Thwaites Glacier, sort of a doomsday glacier, is that we're seeing that sea ice, which is warmer than the ice than Antarctic ice, is sort of pushing back that land, getting between the land and the ice, and kind of then when the tide rises, pushing up the glacier. And that's sort of what's causing this glacier. One of the things that's causing this glacier to really hang on very, very, very sort of by a thread. And so just sort of observing, but, calving glaciers and seeing that sea ice, seeing the changes of color in the ice, listening to the ice. One thing that we're seeing with this melting ice, especially in places like Antarctica, that you're able to hear kind of popping noises. And when you're listening to the ice, and that's air bubbles that have been, compressed from snowfall over centuries and sometimes millennia. They get into the ice and then they end up breaking free and popping as the ice melts. So, little things like that you can observe. And if you have any kind of, again, not knowing where you are, but if you're, can look down on any part of the glacier from the ships, and you can see sort of these glaciers that are kind of breaking apart, and they look kind of like little rivers of ice running down. You can see how the ice is shifting as it's melting. So I think those are pretty interesting things to look for. So, but overall, I'm excited for you. That's very neat.
And another question just came in. Actually, and you just mentioned this, but with Maine's unique position as the only state with both senators on the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, what U.S. climate policies would you advocate as most effective and equitable? There you go. It's your forum now. You can choose what to do.
Trying to keep this pretty apolitical here, but yeah, we just obviously passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a bit of climate action. I want to get excited from it because it's the largest climate action bill that the U.S. has ever passed, and that helps us give us a little bit of a seat at the table at big negotiations where we're, as the U.S., saying what we want, but we're not following through with any action. So that gives us a little bit of leverage, perhaps, but it's, in terms of what needs to be done, very minuscule. and the US does not have a good track record. I'm at the UN right now, and we were in a conversation earlier today talking about global loss and damages, which is when, countries, for example, Mozambique, get inundated with a global disaster and end up having to take loans to pay for it. But that disaster wasn't caused by Mozambique. The Mozambique doesn't have the finances to repay those loans. So who's responsible? How do we deal? And the US and other countries have put forth this money that they say that they're financing these issues. And the US has contributed 5% of what it's promised. So US does not have a good track record here. But certainly one policy that has been on the table repeatedly and has had support from both major political parties is looking at sort of pricing carbon. And we are one of the few countries that certainly Western countries, only Western country that does not have a domestic carbon price. And certainly as we are facing increasing forthcoming border tariffs from other countries, that's going to be something that I think we may want to look at. And if you look at the equity side, obviously depends how one works different policies, because they can be equitable, they cannot be equitable in many different ways. But what has been proposed on the table as recently as the summer has been a system where we have this price on carbon, but it's a price from the polluter perspective. So this isn't necessarily seeing gas becoming more expensive. This is saying that if I run this organization and I pollute X amount, I have to pay for that pollution. So that's encouraging me as a polluter to contribute, to look for other alternatives, invest in other less or no polluting options. But as a consumer, where this comes is that how the policy has been proposed is that the money that is accumulated from polluters is then presented as a dividend. This is a system that they do in Canada. It's a system that they run with oil money in Alaska. We've seen it, it's something that we see around the world. So that as a consumer, as a private citizen, I receive a certain amount of money that is a sort of a paycheck from this pollution. And then I can use it myself individually, whether that's to support my own interest in an electric car, whether it's for food, whatever it is. And so, that's what's been proposed, and it's sort of looking at that equity aspect. But we can also say that, whether that's equitable, if you give everybody the same amount of money, is that equitable? Because depending on where you are, that money is going to go different places. And, if you're in Portland or a big city, you have a lot more access to certain things than you do in other parts of the state and other parts of the country. And what, for example, what that can mean is that if you wanted an electric car in Portland, there are lots of places to charge it. If you're on the 95 corridor, there's a lot of places to charge one. If you're elsewhere in the state, there aren't necessarily. So you're going to get sort of a different bang for the buck in different places. But that's one policy that's been negotiated extensively, repeatedly on the table with bipartisan support, and looks at that equity aspect. So there are others, but that's one.
And you said you're at the UN right now. What are you doing at the UN now?
Yes, so I'm at the UN General Assembly, which is a meeting in New York right now. And it's a 2-week-long meeting. We're just starting the second week right now, which is also New York Climate Week. And I am basically there to engage as part of my day job. I engage with global heads of states and CEOs to sort of look at Arctic climate science, but not necessarily Arctic climate science per se, but how that contributes to global risks around the world. So what are the changes in the Arctic, and then how do those create global disasters or sea level? The Arctic, Greenland is the biggest contributor to sea level rise right now, and it's melting at a rate of about 14 million liters per second on average. And we've confirmed 2 or 3 weeks ago that just because of the destabilization of the Greenlandic ice shelf, that even if we were to cut all fossil fuels, no more emissions of any sort, completely stopped any kind of global warming, we've locked in about 10 inches of sea level rise. And due to fluid dynamics and Earth's gravity, that is going to be felt first, as far away as possible. So it's going to be felt in the tropics first. And those are the states that are typically those low-lying states. Think of the low-lying Pacific states, Kiribati, that's even thought about relocating the entire country a couple of years ago because they didn't see a future for themselves. And how do you get around migrating an entire population, an entire country, an entire nationality? So I'm working, with global leaders and heads of state to figure out how, not just why they should take climate action for itself, but how they need to for their own interests as well. So, talking with CEOs of clothing companies, fashion industries that, aren't climate conscious, but saying that, here's this water security, here's this problem, and here's why it's directly affecting you. And here's why you need to be involved in this. And, speaking to them in, for example, so many of these businesses are focused on paychecks and they're just seeing dollar signs. And if they're so far able to effectively pay their way out of any kind of climate difference, but that's not going to be able to continue. So what are the economic impacts and how do we mitigate these? And that all has to come back to addressing climate issues. But just because the Arctic is warming so much faster and it's, it controls so much of the jet stream, which is creating storms and heat waves. And when you think that, every degree that the atmosphere warms, it can hold about 7% more moisture. So that's a lot more rain. That's a lot more storm, a lot more powerful storms. So, really trying to make what's going on in the world very tangible and very relevant for people who have control, do something about it, frankly. I mean, you talk about,
Right.
What can you do as an individual citizen in Maine? And it's so hard often it's so easy just to feel like one doesn't have that control, but here people do. So so I'm working with them.
Well, Susana, thank you very much. We're out of time. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your trek and about what you're working on. And I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. And we hope that you join us the next time we have Maine Voices Live. And everybody have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Ray. And thank you to the Press Herald and Stroudwater and Northern Lights and Hope. So